magazine lists him among the top 25 most influential evangelicals in the nation. Glenn Beck calls him the Library of Congress in shoe leather. With a personal collection of more than 100,000 documents before the War of 1812, historian David Barton may be the most influential force for constitutional conservatism in the nation. As the president and founder of Wall Builders, Barton communicates with over 1,000 state congressmen and tracks over 10,000 pieces of legislation every year. No one outside the Beltway has done more to prepare the way for Americans to return to their historical, biblical foundation than David Barton. City Elders hosts author, teacher, historian David Barton.
Put your hands together and welcome David Barton.
Bless you, brother. Bless you, brother. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, guys. I've definitely got to do an update on some of those stats. We now have over 160,000 documents, and so there's a lot that's changed since then. And last year we monitored 159,000 pieces of legislation. So there's a lot going on in the states right now. It's a different discussion. I want to talk tonight about where we are as a people and as a nation. So Scripture says, be diligent to know the state of your flocks. Scriptures also tell us that if you judge yourself, you'll not be judged. It says judgment is begin at the house of God. So if you look at where the church is right now, we do a lot of polling work with a lot of national pollsters as well, George Barna. So we do political pollsters, culture pollsters, etc. A lot of polling. And if you look at where we are now, take something like Christians and reading the Word. Right now, only 9% of professing Christians read the Bible on a daily basis. This is the most illiterate the church has ever been, biblically illiterate the church has ever been in recorded polling history. It may have been worse at some other point in time. We just don't know because we don't have records. It's the worst it's been since we've been polling, and that's about 100 years. Right now, only 6% of Americans have a biblical worldview. So only 1 in 16 Americans can look at an issue and see it the way the Bible sees it. Doesn't matter whether it's economic issues or moral issues or anything else. We just don't have the foundation we used to have in knowing what the Bible says. If you look specifically at cultural type things that are going on, Christian behavior, take something like divorce. If you look at divorce statistics, and of course the Bible is real clear on this, Malachi 3:16, God hates divorce. Matthew 19, Jesus really spoke against no-fault divorce very clearly. Lots of passages, and what we know right now, when you look at divorce rate among Christians, or among born-again Christians, not just Christians professing, but those who have had a life-changing experience with Jesus Christ, the divorce rate is 32%. So you can imagine what it is for the rest of the nation. For the rest of the nation, it's 33%. So born-again Christians aren't much better than the rest of the nation. But I will point out, for atheists and agnostics, they have the lowest divorce rate in the nation. Wow. So that's a weird thing. Well, I prayed about it, and the marriage didn't get fixed, so God must want me to have a divorce. Apparently, we don't do much really focusing on changing things, and so people who don't pray at all have a stronger marriage than people who do pray. That shouldn't be that way. And by the way, 87% of Christians who did get divorced got divorced after becoming born again. So that's not good standards for the church. That doesn't reflect biblical teaching. If I take something like abortion, right now we know that with all the abortions in America, 70% of abortions are performed on professing Christians, and 23% of abortions are performed on evangelical Christians. So evangelicals, the Bible will be inside. And by the way, if you take an issue like homosexuality, Bible very clear, 1 Corinthians 6, homosexuals shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. And yet right now among active homosexuals, 23% claim to be professing Christians. Now, that's oxymoronic. It's an impossibility if God's word is true. We just don't know God's word anymore. And so we don't let it affect our behavior, what we do in culture. We see that in a lot of ways. Last example I'll give you is lying. In polling, we know that right now only 35% of Christians said that they had not deliberately told a lie in the past month. Deliberately told a lie in the past month. When asked, why would you deliberately tell a lie? The top three answers given by Christians. Number one was, well, if you're asking me why I lie deliberately, number one answer is, if I told the truth, it would devastate my friends. So I'd rather lie than tell the truth if it's going to hurt someone. That's not a good answer. Reason number two, if I only lie about little things, and God doesn't care about little things, how bad is your theology if that's what you believe? I mean, but again, only 6% of the nation has a biblical worldview, so that's a reflection there. And reason number three is I lied. I know it's a sin, but that's why Jesus died on the cross for me, was to cover my sins. Oh, I see. The more we sin, the more his death works. Is that the? So you look at behavior, and in all these areas, the church is not doing good at all. So there's a lot of problems there. And specifically, George Barton says that in all the polling he's done for all these years, he says, with 70 different moral behaviors we study, we can't find any difference between Christians and non-Christians in their behavior. 70 different moral categories. If you judge a tree by its fruits, there's not any difference between Christians and non-Christians when you look at the fruits that they produce. And that's not a good position for the church to be in. So, and looking at where we are in America, it's easy to understand what we're seeing right now statistically. When you look at the number of professing Christians in America, back in 2000, 85% of the nation professed Christianity as their belief. In 20 years, now in 2020, it's down to 65%. So we've dropped 20 points in 20 years because what does being a Christian get me? It's the same behavior as people who aren't Christians. There's really no reason for it. And so we're seeing a turn. Now, this is why, these kind of stats is why we see people saying we need a change in America. And by the way, I will point out that when we poll people who leave the church and say, why did you leave? They say, because there's nothing relevant there. I don't get anything that helps me with my life and what I need. And that's true. We're really not addressing things that really affect people's lives. We've got a lot of things to say about how they should act spiritually, but not necessarily about how they should act economically, how they should act in raising their kids. We don't want to get down in the mess. You know, the scripture says that if there's no, where the stall is clean, there's no ox. Well, if you live in the country like I do, what that means is if you don't have an ox, you don't have productivity. There's nothing going on. But if you have an ox there, you got a lot of mess to clean up. And so that's just part of it. If you want something to be productive and grow, you're going to have a lot of mess to clean up, and a lot of us don't like cleaning up messes. And we don't like messes inside the church, and we don't like stepping into messes, and we don't like raising issues that are messes. And so that's what we're seeing is people are saying, I just don't get anything out of church anymore. It doesn't give me anything on how to live. This is why we're hearing that we need a revival. And people are right. We do need a revival. We're praying for revival. I don't think that prayer is going to get answered the way we think it's going to get answered. I think that God's definition of revival is very, very different from ours, and I want to give you some historical and biblical examples of that. When you look at revival, the major problem we have is we're praying for revival, and we have a national focus. We're really focused on national things, and that's not the way revivals work. The problem we have is all of us get our news from somewhere. As we get our news, if you're on the right, you're probably listening to Fox or Victory News or Newsmax or Epic News or something. If you're on the left, it's going to be CNN, MSNBC, whatever it is. Nonetheless, we all get a heavy dose of national news. You haven't heard a story on any of that news stuff about Watertown, New York, or about Scottsbluff, Nebraska, about Jack Sparrow, Texas, or Yukon, Oklahoma, or anything. We don't get that. All we get is a heavy dose of national news. And as a result, when you look at what's happening nationally, we're well aware what's going on with the White House. We're well aware what's going on with the courts. We're well aware what's going on with the Congress. And that's very much my life. I mean, I'm very engaged in that. Let me just take all three of those. Back in August, as Afghanistan was falling, 3 weeks before it fell, things were so bad that the JSOC, which is the Joint Special Operations folks, they called us and said, hey, would you guys take over getting the civilians out of Afghanistan? And so our guys were running the airports as the things fell. And we could not get our planes off the ground. We had them loaded with people. We vetted everyone. We have one of the best vetting programs. Before President Trump ever talked about extreme vetting, we were doing that. We've been taking persecuted Christians out of the Middle East for the last 6 years, and we want to make sure we're not carrying Taliban or terrorists out of there. We have an extreme vetting program, and we've uncovered a lot of folks that are terrorists trying to get out and wanting to come to America. So we took over that, and we started flying the planes out of there. And the biggest impediment we had was not the military, it was the U.S. State Department. Now, we're dealing with the Taliban, but the State Department stood in our way. We had planes in the air going to Albania, and the State Department called ahead and said, no, send those planes back. Don't let those people out of Afghanistan. Wait a minute, you told us to get them out. And we had planes going to Macedonia. State Department called ahead to the ambassador in Macedonia and said, don't let them land. Send them back. So we had all these people. Now, we ended up getting 13,000 out, but the problem, and 13,000, 1,200 of them were American citizens. About 4,800 of them were persecuted Christians. The others were SIVs, allies. Even though we were primarily looking for persecuted Christians, we're not going to leave somebody behind if they're going to get killed. I mean, we're getting them out of there, including the American citizens. And our list right now still has thousands on that list. And we can't get them out because we can't get the State Department to clear out the lily pad countries where we send all these people. So I'm frustrated with the State Department. And that's why we called a whole bunch of members of the House and Senate, got them to call the Secretary of State Blinken. Blinken said, I'm going to help you. And so he got the State Department folks and said, let those guys out. State Department said, we're not going to. He said, I'm Secretary of State. Let them out. We're not. I mean, it was crazy what we went through in those weeks as all this was crashing down, trying to save people. And so I am frustrated like crazy. I've been involved in 13 cases in the U.S. Supreme Court, involved in other cases in the Supreme Court right now. I know what goes on in D.C. I know what happens at the courts. I know what happens in Congress. I know what happens and it really frustrates me because, you see, I can't do a single thing about it. And I know so many guys, and they can't do stuff about it. We're handicapped by bureaucracies and other things that are beyond. We can't fire people in the federal government. When we had the thing 4 years ago where the 300,000 veterans died at the hands of the Veterans Department, the medical care there, Trump came in 2017, passed a law that allowed us to fire those people for the first time. And then 2 months ago, 2 months ago, the Bureau of Labor Relations said, no, that was a bad ruling. You can all have your jobs back now. So we can't fire people in D.C. But see, here's the deal. I've got a lot of connections, more than most people do, and I can't get anything done. So what happens, we all see the national news, and what happens, we get frustrated, we get paralyzed, we get angry. But problem is we should be looking at local stuff, but that's not where we get our news. So let me take you back and show you some history and show you some Bible and how this works. If I take you back to the American War for Independence, the first 4 battles in the American War for Independence, if you take top right and go counterclockwise, top right is the Battle of Lexington, top left is the Battle of Concord, North Bridge at Concord, bottom left is the Battle of the Road to Boston, and the bottom right is the Battle of Bunker Hill. Those are the first 4 battles in the American War for Independence. And it's interesting that in all those battles, here come the British, here come the British showing up, and nobody in any of those cities contacted the national commander-in-chief, said, George, you're in charge of the military. We need your help. Get here now. We're overwhelmed. Nobody contacted George and said, get here. The reason was they said, it's our community, so we'll take care of it. George, you got more important things to do. We'll take care of our community. And so what happened, that literally is what happened. When you take that first battle, the Battle of Lexington, 700 British came to town. And when those 700 British came to town, we're told in the history books that 70 courageous Americans went out to face them, and that's not accurate. What happened was the church of the Reverend Jonas Clark went out to face them, and he had 70 guys in his church. And they said, this is our town. You're just not going to do this here. We're going to stand in your way. And so that's what the first battle was a church saying, you're not going to do this in our community. This is our community. You're not gonna... Now, the British overwhelmed them because Pastor Clark had said in the biblical view of war, you're not allowed to be offensive. You can be defensive, not offensive. You can't start anything. But if they fire, you can return fire. You have a biblical right of self-defense, Exodus 22:2 and all these other passages. So Deacon John Parker, when he had them assembled, said, remember what Pastor Clark's been telling us. And so engraved in the stone of the Minuteman there with John Parker, the square there at Lexington, it says, don't fire unless fired upon. You can't shoot first because they have to start it. That's the only way God's going to bless it. He said, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. And that's what happened. The British got the first shot, 700 first shots. That's why 18 Americans hit the ground that morning. We didn't get to return fire in any significant way because we were just nailed. And by the way, it was black patriots and white patriots that hit the ground that morning because they all went to church together, Reverend Clark's church. But after the British got done there, they went on to North Bridge at Concord. And when they got to North Bridge at Concord, it was there that we're told that 300 courageous townspeople went out to face them. And that's not right either. It was the church of the Reverend William Emerson who went out, and he had 300 men in his church. And they said, by the way, we heard that you already fired at our guys back here, so now we get to shoot. And that's where... So That's where the first British hit the ground, was at Concord. And the British said, this is not headed the right direction because there's 700 of us and we face 70 of them. Now we face 300 of them. This thing's going to keep growing. We better get back to Boston and get some reinforcements. So they turned around, promptly started marching back to Boston, and they didn't get back in time. That's what's called the Road to Boston, because on that 19-mile march back, they ended up facing 4,500 Americans on that way back. Now, where'd those Americans come from? Well, it was Reverend Payson Phillips who grabbed his church and said, okay, let's go. We got to defend the area. And you had Reverend Benjamin Ball. So it was all these churches that went out and were defending the area. See, the deal was, this is our community, and you're not going to do this in our community. Even when you get to the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Battle of Bunker Hill, you had Reverend Joseph Willard who grabbed 2 companies out of his church, said, let's go get with the other churches. Got to defend the town from the British. So you look at what happened in the American War for Independence, and George was really important. Don't get the idea he wasn't. But he wasn't involved in very many battles. There were more than 80 battles in the American Revolution. George was not involved in just a handful of battles. Now, we really needed him. We needed him in Yorktown. We needed him at Monmouth. We needed him at Brandywine, places like that. And even there, all the local people showed up to help him. So it was this thing of help doesn't come from the top. Help comes from your own community, and you take care of your own community. And so that was the local focus we had. We had this thing that, all right, if we're going to win the American War for Independence, we got to win all the community battles. And that's literally what happened. More than 80 different community battles. There were a few national battles. Mostly we just won the communities, and that's why we won the nation. So that local focus is really important. Well, we're praying for revival, and we think that revivals are exactly the same. Revivals, they occur locally. They're not national. Well, what do you mean they're not national? We had the Great Awakenings. Those are national revivals. No, they're really not. Yeah, they are, because you have people like George Whitefield. I mean, George Whitefield, he preached for 34 years in the First Great Awakening. He preached 18,000 sermons. That's a national revival. No, it's really not. Because you see, what's significant about Whitefield is in all that preaching that he did, Whitefield, 80% of all Americans heard him preach a sermon. Now, talk about message penetration. 80% of Americans haven't heard Joe Biden with all the technology we've got today. There's nearly 100 million Americans that aren't even registered to vote. They don't care what happens, and they're not going to keep up with anything that's going on nationally. 65.3% of adult Americans are registered to vote, so roughly 100 million are not registered to vote. So we had greater message penetration with Whitefield with no technology than what we have today. How'd that happen? Because he was a chaplain of the colony of Georgia. He got on his horse in Georgia, and he rode to Maine, and he stopped at every single community he could find and preached as he went. And then he rode back from Maine back to Georgia, and he did that 7 times, back and forth. See, 80% of Americans physically heard him preach a sermon because he was in 80% of the communities of America. Every community he went, he would stop and a revival would break out. Here's 300 in this community, and 700 here, and 12,000 in Philadelphia. Everywhere he went, you had a revival, but they were all local revivals. See, that's why today we don't know names like these names here. Samuel Cooper? Who in the heck is he? Samuel Cooper's the guy that kept the revival going for decades in Boston after it broke out in Boston. He's the local pastor that made sure the revival kept going in Boston. In the same way, you have Gilbert Tennant. He's the guy who made sure that in Philadelphia and out in the valley to the west of Philadelphia, the revival kept going for years and years and years. And the same thing with Samuel Davies in the rural valleys of Virginia. Once the revival's going, he's the guy who keeps it going. It's not a national revival. It was so many communities had a revival that it looked like a national revival. And that's why historians say, oh, we had a national revival under Whitefield. No, we had hundreds of local community revivals, but it looked like a national revival. So in thinking this thing, we look at it nationally, and it's really not. You have to look at the thing in the sense of a local focus, not a national focus. Now, let me take that down to specifically what that means and how we behave right now. If I take you into the voting area, I'm just going to show you voting stats for a minute. In America, if you want to be a voter in America, 2 legal requirements. You got to be 18 years old and you got to be a legal citizen. If you're 18 and a legal citizen, you can vote. 100% of all people who are 18 and legal citizens can vote. The only thing we do is we do ask you, please register, because we want to make sure somebody doesn't vote 7 times in your name or you don't vote 7 times. And that's where we have 65.3% of Americans registered to vote. This is where 100 million Americans aren't even checked in. They can't even be salt and light. Even they're Christians, they can't be salt and light because they have no capacity to have any influence on the direction of the nation. They're just checked out. So what you find is there's 2 kinds of elections. The election we had last year is a presidential election. Now, when you take a presidential election, in the last 11 presidential elections, the average voter turnout is 54% for the last 11 presidential elections. But that's not 54% of adults, that's 54% of registered voters. That's 54% of 65%, which means only 36% of Americans vote for president. It takes half of that to win, which is 18%. In the last 21 off-year elections, and that's what we're going to have next November, is an off-year election where we choose governors and senators and reps and congressmen, et cetera. In the last 21 off-year elections, the average voter turnout is 39%, or 38%. But that's 38% of 65%, which is 26% of Americans vote to choose our governors, et cetera. And it takes half of that to win, it's 13%. So what you're looking at, for the last 11 presidential elections, 1 out of 5 Americans chooses the President of the United States, and 1 out of 8 Americans chooses our governors and our senators and our reps. That's not very good stewardship. The way we spend money, everybody thinks that everybody's involved, that this is a massive, it's not. We're largely uninvolved as a nation. Now, let me take it to the local level. In the local level, the average voter turnout is 6% in local elections. But that's 6% of 65%, which means only 4% of adults vote, which it takes half of that to win, which you're looking at 2%. Let me show you how this works practically. Take a city, a big city like Los Angeles. Los Angeles is the second largest city in the United States. Los Angeles itself has a population of the city that's larger than 23 individual states in the United States. So if you're elected mayor of Los Angeles, that's like being governor of 23 states. It's a big deal. And right now, Eric Garcetti is the mayor of Los Angeles. And Eric Garcetti, and boy, is he bad. He is so anti-faith and so shut the churches down. Just so many bad things about it. Garcetti brags that he was elected mayor of LA with 2.9% of the vote. So essentially, you have a governor with 2.9% of the vote. And then if you take Houston, Houston is the 5th largest city in the United States. Houston's there are 20 states. The population in Houston is larger than the population of 20 individual states. And Houston elected a lady named Anise Parker as mayor of Houston. Now, Anise Parker was elected on the books with 4.9% of the vote, but that was 4.9% of 65%. She was elected with about 3.3% of the vote. Now, once she got elected, she passed what was called an equal rights ordinance. This thing is called HERO, Houston Equal Rights Ordinance. So there's the top 200 cities in the United States have all passed equal rights ordinances. Some call them equal rights amendment or human rights amendment, but top 200 cities have passed this. And what it says is, hey, if you say that marriage is between a man and a woman, that is a hate crime. And that's what she said. She was the first open lesbian mayor of Houston. And she said, you people that say that marriage is between a man and a woman, that is a personal attack on me. That's a hate crime. No, time out. Anise, we've been saying marriage is between a man and a woman long before you ever got elected. It doesn't have anything to do with you. God's been saying this 5,800 years back to Adam and Eve. It has nothing to do with a hate crime. And her position, no, that's a hate crime. You're attacking me. So once she got this passed, she went after pastors across the city. Said, you guys, I know you guys have said it. And so that's where she subpoenaed all the papers and records, 16 different forms of communication from pastors. I want to see your sermon notes. I want to see your phone records. I want to see the notes off your computer. I'm going to find out if you ever said marriage between a man and woman, because if you are, you're in trouble. See, San Antonio passed the same deal. San Antonio passed one of these, and in San Antonio, it was a Class C misdemeanor to say that marriage is between a man and a woman. If you said marriage between a man and a woman, it's a $500 a day fine. You can never be allowed to hold office in San Antonio, and you can never do business with the city of San Antonio. That means you can't be a parking contractor or a landscaper. So 200 cities have these onerous bills. Well, in Houston, the people elected said, whoa, that's not why we elected you. And so we got organized in the city of Houston. We went in and got 4,500 churches engaged. Those 4,500 churches got engaged, and they signed the petitions to have a ballot referendum on that policy measure, that equal rights ordinance. This is why we elected you. We elected you to stop the crime and keep the roads running. And so 4,500 churches got involved. And I remember the night before the election, because we worked with those 4,500 churches, get them educated and get them up on what's going on. And the night before the election, it's either the Houston Post or Houston Chronicle did a poll and said, we're going to lose. Our side's going to lose. It's going to be a 64. We've done all the polling. You're going to lose 60-40. Well, that may be right with the 3.3% turnout, but the difference was that we had a 14% turnout, and that 14% turnout, we won by a 22-point margin. We beat them 61 to 39, and they haven't brought, and we've gone to a lot of cities across the United States that had these and gotten them repealed, gotten the churches involved, gotten them active, and they get these things off the books. We've done it in Arkansas and Oklahoma and all these different states. So it's interesting to see what happened in Houston. And then if you take the city of Fort Worth, now this is backyard for me. You know, Fort Worth is real close to where I grew up, and it's close to where we have our ranch, and so that's backyard. It was Fort Worth 6 years ago, and the Fort Worth Independent School District that said, you know, we really don't think that you need gender bathrooms anymore. So in the Fort Worth Independent School District, you just choose whatever you want to be, and it's the same with locker rooms, and it's the same with showers. So kids can choose whatever they want and go to anyone they want. And I mean, we're looking at this and saying, say what? This is Texas, or Baja, Oklahoma, if you prefer, whatever. Nonetheless, we're down there. But what happened was the Secretary of Education under President Obama, Arnie Duncan, picked up and said, that's a great policy. And so he made it a federal policy that says any school district that gets federal funds, you can't do gender stuff. You have to have no bathrooms, locker rooms, all of it, whatever anybody wants. And so now, see, this is disturbing for me because I'm a cowboy from Texas. This background is cowboy, farmer, and ranching, etc. And so Fort Worth, if you know, is known as Cowtown, USA. That's the name of it. And Fort Worth is where this crazy policy came from that went all over the nation. I will tell you, no cowboy has any difficulty telling the gender of those cow critters that are right there. If you want to stand behind them, you can tell which are bulls and which are cows and which are steers. It's really, really easy. There is no difficulty. And we've never seen a bull become a cow. We've never seen a cow become a bull. It doesn't happen. And so we're going, are you kidding us? So I was really ticked. And so I looked at Fort Worth, and Fort Worth has 800,000 voters in the city of Fort Worth. In the school board election that chose the president of the school board, who came up with this crazy policy and got it passed that became a national policy, he was elected with less than 1,200 votes. Matter of fact, he was elected with 1,182 votes. So I started looking around, and I instantly found a large Bible-believing church that had 3,000 evangelical adults in the church. Adults in the church. 3,000 even. That one church could have prevented him from being on the school board, which would have saved the whole United States of gender nonsense we've had for the last 6 years. And it goes to a local community. Are you kidding me? And that was in our backyard. So this is the kind of stuff we're seeing. I'll give you two more examples. Bentonville, Arkansas, hometown of Walmart. After this happened, a Christian lady up in Bentonville says, well, you sure ain't doing this at our school. And so she ran for the school board up there, and she got elected. In that town of 40,000, there were a total of 35 votes cast in the school board election. She won the school board election. That's not as good as Riceville, Ohio. In Riceville, Iowa. I said Ohio. Riceville, Iowa. A pig farmer, as I recall, he's a pig farmer. But a farmer up there said, you sure ain't doing this at our school. And so he signed up and ran for school board. And it turned out on election day, he got busy on the farm and didn't vote. And don't jump to the conclusion that he lost by one vote, because that's not what happened. What happened was not a single person voted in the school board election. Had he voted for himself, he would be on the school board. Just had he voted for himself. See, that's local elections. And this is where the battle has got to be won. You're not going to win it at the White House. You're going to win it at the local stuff. And we got this national mentality because of the way our news and everything is done. And we're not seeing what's going on around us. So local focus is what's really important here. Now, trying to get Christians focused on things like this, I want to take you back to one of my favorite founding fathers, Benjamin Rush. He's a signer of the Declaration. John Adams said he's one of the three most notable founders. He said you have George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. This guy started the first Bible Society. He started the Sunday school movement. He's called the father of public schools under the Constitution. He's the most famous physician in America. I can go through all of his creds. He's got a lot of them. What's interesting was he is also called the father of public schools under the Constitution because in 1788 he helped ratify the Constitution, signed the Declaration, ratified the Constitution. Now we're a nation in 1789. He said, you know, we used to be 13 states. Now we're one nation with he said we used to be 13 nations. Now we're one nation with 13 states. But if we're going to survive as a people, what do we need to be teaching in our public schools? And so he came out with a piece in 1790 that says, here's what public schools have to teach if America is going to survive as a nation. And this is why he's called the father of public schools, because he's the guy who really birthed the idea of what we teach in public schools. And so in there he said the number one purpose of a public school is to teach students to love and serve God. He said that's the number one purpose of public schools. He said the number two purpose of public schools is to teach students to love and serve their country. And he said the number three purpose of public schools is to teach students to love and serve their family. Now, I would encourage you to look at the order there. If I were to ask you, given those three institutions, how would you prioritize them? Most Christians today would say, well, it should be God, and then family, and then country. But here's an evangelical, Bible-believing, theologian-level guy who says, no, it should be God, country, and family. Why? Because he pointed out if you ever lose control of your country, it will become the great enemy of your family. And he's exactly right. So much of the stuff we're trying to preserve in family has come from bad policies. It's come from us not being involved in the political system. So this is what we're seeing in schools. I mean, schools have become the cesspool of all the stuff we're fighting against. I mean, we used to teach math, and now we're teaching socialism and everything else under the sun. So little. If you're not aware, America used to be the number one nation in the world in literacy. We had the highest literacy rate in the world. And then we said, no, we got better things to teach. We fell to number 62 in the world in literacy. There's only 23 industrialized nations. We're down in third world level. We have now recovered to about 43rd in the world in literacy. But for the last 15 years, 19% of all students who graduate from high school have been 100% illiterate for the last 15 years. So we spend $162,000 in tax money for 13 years of school, K through 12, and 19% of those who graduate can't read anything. See, that's because we're not teaching those things anymore. We're indoctrinating. And this is where all the cesspools come from, which is why so many people are now focused on school boards. So when you look at what's happening in the school boards, this is where local elections have become very significant. In the time I've got left, I'm going to take you through some of the results. I'm going to take you to Virginia for a moment. Now, you heard about what happened with Youngkin in Virginia and the change there with the governor and all the change in the House and the Senate, or their legislature, their House of Burgesses, their delegates. It's interesting what the untold story is back 11 months before the election, Faith Wins. I worked really closely with Faith Wins. They went in all over the state and started getting with the churches and said, guys, here's the deal. You need to understand how the process works. Now, I'm an athlete, I spent a lot of my life as athletics, but Paul tells us in 1 Timothy that you can't be crowned as an athlete if you don't run according to the rules. You have to know what the rules are, and if you violate the rules, you can't win. We're not paying any attention to what the rules are in politics, and we're not winning because we don't know them. He said, so here's the deal. When it comes time for election, you really need poll watchers and you need election officials. So out of the churches, they provided 1,300 to the state who went through the state training, became certified election officials, able to challenge ballots. And what happened on election night, they started doing that. They said, whoa, state law says you have to have the last 4 digits of your social security number on the outside of any mail-in ballot, otherwise it's not valid. We're not taking ballots that don't have the last 4 digits. And so they started challenging, said, wait a minute, this guy's been dead 30 years. We're not taking that ballot. So they were challenging these ballots, and as it turned out, 7.25% of the ballots were challenged because of being illegal. That's already the election right there. You let those 7.25% go through, it's a whole different result. But they didn't stop there because they said, you know what? What's going to happen is Northern Virginia is all D.C., and they're all crazy up there. You guys in the small rural churches are going to have to outperform. You're going to have to turn out higher than you ever have because you got to make up for all those crazy people up in Washington, D.C. that live in Northern Virginia. And what happened was on election night, those rural areas had a 12% higher turnout than what they have in presidential elections. And this is not only an off-year election, this is an off-year weird election. You know, New Jersey and Virginia have those weird elections in really off years. And so the rural churches stepped up and overperformed. That's why you have a significant change with 3 Christian leaders in Virginia, which is so different from what it's been, but it's because the churches took care of their local communities. This is our community. We'll make sure the voter turnout. This is our community. We're going to check all the ballots here. We're not having any illegal votes going. See, that's the kind of stuff that's happening. Let me take you into Colorado. I've been working in Colorado with folks there on several races, and we got involved in a couple hundred school board races. Actually, it turned out to be a couple hundred, but we produced voters' guides on school board races. So what we did was 130 specific candidates. We had 18 different districts we were running in, and we produced 141,000 voters' guides that we just gave to local churches. Said, Christians, if you're concerned about what's being taught in the schools, here's the voter's guide. Look at 5 things being taught in schools, whether these candidates are for or against them. All the craziness is out there. If you want someone who's not going to teach that craziness on the school board, here's people. And so we did not spend a single dollar in Colorado, and we were able to win 55% of those races without a single dollar, simply because the church stepped up and said, we want the good guys to win. And so we've had a huge turnover in Colorado. The same thing. The 1776 Project created a PAC, and they said, we need to get involved in school board races. So in school board races, there were 58 races where they got involved, and they did spend money and other things in it, and 44 of the 58 won, which is 76%. So across the nation just now a few weeks back, we picked up hundreds and hundreds of school board seats all across the nation, which will make a difference in what kind of leaders you're going to have 10 to 15 years from now as you look at legislatures. So keep going with this. Keep running some of this stuff down. I just want to show you some headlines. Candidates opposing critical race theory COVID-19 mandates win Minnesota school boards. Is Minnesota a red state or a blue state? Blue. And all the red guys won on the school boards. How'd that happen? It's interesting. We got churches involved. Made all sorts of difference. This one I love. 19-year-old who saw his senior year disrupted by COVID shutdowns unseats the incumbent in the school board race. So this 19-year-old kid who was going to be a senior, they shut the school down right under him in his senior year. He says, I'm running for school board. And he beat the incumbent by 17 points. Now, I will say it is nice to finally have an adult on the school board at some point. So this one, a slate of conservative candidates declare victory in hotly contested Denver? That's super blue. That's as crazy as Boulder. Yeah, conservatives won the school board races in Denver. 3 of 4 conservative challengers win seats on Wichita. Wichita is the most liberal city in Kansas. Now, Kansas is not like New York, but Wichita is pretty crazy, and yet the conservatives won the school boards in Wichita. Conservative-backed candidates win Treasure Valley. Treasure Valley, oh, that's Boise. Yeah, Boise is the most liberal city in Idaho, and it's conservatives that won the school board seats there. Conservatives win big in school board elections. School policy changes could follow. School board races in major Colorado Springs area. Colorado Springs, yeah, all over the nation we're seeing. Houston, we won the school board races in Houston. Now, Houston is about 3.2 million people. If you had 5,000 races, you won the school board in Houston out of 3.2 million people. We won the school board in Houston. So all this stuff is starting to change because we're focusing at that level. Now, having said that, let me go through the rest of this real quick. If you're going to vote for good people, you got to have good people on the ballot. Where do you get good people on the ballot? Let me take you back to what the Bible says. There's the parable of the trees of the field in Judges chapter 9, verses 8 through 15. It says the trees of the field got together and said, we need civil government. We got to choose somebody to be our leader, our governor, our mayor, whatever it is. We need a leader for the trees of the field. And so what the scripture says, the trees went forth to anoint a king over them. And they went first to the olive tree, and they said, that's a good tree, olive tree, really productive. They said, reign thou over us. Come be our leader. And the olive tree said to them, no, I'm not going to get involved in that stuff. Said, should I leave my fatness wherewith by me they honor both God and man and go be promoted over the trees? I'm not getting involved in that secular stuff. I got really important stuff going right here with what I'm doing with my olive. And they said, well, let's go to the fig tree. And they said to the fig tree, come down and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, no, I'm not going to get involved in that. Should I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go be promoted over the trees? No, not me. And so it said they went next to the vine, another good tree, good fruit. And they said to the vine, come down and reign over us. And the vine said to them, nah, it's not going to be me. Should I leave my wine, which cheers both God and man, and go be promoted over the trees? Now, notice the tendency here. They've gone to all the good trees in the forest, and all the good trees had good reasons why they couldn't do it. There's just too much that we've got going on. The kids are in soccer and everything out there. And so what happens next, the Bible says that next, it says the trees of the field then said the trees unto the bramble. Now, that's not a good direction to be headed, but that's all that's left because none of the good guys want to run. So we're stuck with the bramble, and said to the bramble, come down and reign over us. And wouldn't you know it, they're the ones that like being in office. It says, the bramble says, if you anoint me king over you, then come and put your trust in my shadow. So I'll be happy to be your leader. How much fun is it to sit in the shadow of a bramble bush? I would argue that we have way too many thorn bushes running today. Now, I will also argue that we've got a lot of good candidates that God has raised up, like Kev over here. We've got good candidates that God has raised up that have the right motivation, but it's really hard to get most good people to run because they've all got good reasons why they can't be involved. And what happens is the more good people that say no, the more likely you are to get thorn bushes as your rulers. And that's what we've had in school boards all over the United States. We haven't been paying attention to what's been going on in our schools the last 10, 12, 15 years. We just assumed they were like us. No, we got brambles ruling. So all these brambles ruling everywhere. So how do you avoid brambles as rulers? Again, we go back to the Bible and Exodus chapter 18, verses 21, you had this situation where Moses at that time was ruling over all the people of Israel by himself, more than 3 million people, and he's hearing every dispute. His father-in-law, Jethro, comes along and says, you have lost your brain. There's no way you can make the decision for 3 million individual people who come and bring every gripe to you. He said, so here's what you need to do. And so Jethro gave him the advice that says, provide out of all the people able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of tens. You need to have federal, you need to have state, you need to have regional or county, and you need to have local guys run it. And so he laid out really the grid that we have in a Republican form of government where you have all these levels, and you need leaders at all those levels. And who do you want to be your leaders? Well, he gave the criterion. Able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. You need those kind of people running for office at all different levels. Now, where do you get them? Now, it's interesting. Moses actually repeats this incident again in Deuteronomy 1 and then again in Deuteronomy 16. He says, Jethro came to me and told me this is what I need to do because I was crazy for doing what it was. He said, and I took that as a word from the Lord. And when I took it as a word from the Lord, I went and did this. And it's interesting because Jethro said you need to provide out. How do you provide out? Moses tells us in Deuteronomy 1, Deuteronomy 16, he said, I went out among you. Now, this is Moses. He said, I went out among you and chose from among you those that were good, and I placed them before you and let you choose the ones you wanted. Oh, so we had an election, but somebody had to go recruit the right people to be in the election. Moses turned into a recruiter. He went and started recruiting. Hey, you've been a deacon in the church a long time, and I know you're really good on finances. You got your kids in good shape. You need to be in city council. See, suddenly we turn into recruiters and we start getting the good people to run, and that's what Moses did. He said, I put them in front of you, and then y'all chose who you wanted for leaders, and that's how they got their leaders. And see, that's what it means to provide out. And this is where Christians, I think, have really fallen down. We don't do enough recruiting of other good people, and then the good people have given us a dozen reasons why. And I'll tell you that in Texas, when I helped run the Republican Party there, I was in charge of recruiting. I was one of the 2 state officials in every state. In the Republican Party, you have to have a male and a female leader, and I was the male leader of the state of Texas. So I had 2,100 candidates under me, and for me to recruit a state representative candidate usually took me 100 phone calls because it would take me a while to find the right candidate with a good reputation. Then once I did, I would find about 15 or 20 of his friends and get them all to call him. And they started beating on him and says, you need to run for office. You know, I'm just an outsider from state party calling and say run. But when all your friends start leaning on you and say you need to run, you start listening a whole lot better. And that's what we had done for a long time. So I'll close this out with this quote from Charles Finney. Charles Finney, of course, was in the Second Great Awakening, great minister, great revival. It's estimated that in 1 year alone, he led more than 100,000 people to Christ just in 1 year. But in 1835, he did a book on revivals. It's called Lectures on Revival. And what he did was he said, look, we're praying for revival. He said, that's crazy. The Bible tells us how to have revival. For example, if you take 2 Chronicles 7:14, it says, if my people which are called by my name will do this stuff, then I'm going to do this stuff. Don't pray for God to do this stuff if you're not doing this stuff over here. He said, if you guys will do this, then I'll do this. Well, you can pray all day long for that to happen, but if you're not doing this, you're not. And that's what he said. He looked at all the if-then verses in the Bible. He said, if you want this, then you got to be doing this stuff up here. And that's what his lectures are about. If you want revival, here's what the Bible says you have to do if God's going to respond. And it was based on that. It's interesting. Lecture number 15 is an interesting lecture. In that lecture, he said the church must take right ground in regard to politics. Politics are part of a religion in a country as this, and Christians must do their duty to the country as part of their duty to God. In other words, if God's going to send us a revival, we're going to have Christian folks get involved, because when righteousness exalts a nation, God will bless it, but you don't have righteousness if you don't have righteous rulers to create that righteousness in policy. So it takes righteous people to elect righteous people. It takes righteous voters to elect righteous officials to get righteous policy that God can bless. And that's what he understood. So it's interesting. That's revival lecture number 15. He said, God will bless or curse this nation according to the course that Christians take in politics. It was revival lecture number 15, which was called Hindrances to Revival. He said, these are the specific things that will keep you from having a revival. If you don't get involved in politics, you won't have. What a different mentality it was back then than what it is now. We think, we've got to stay out of that stuff. That's secular stuff. No, that's what you need to get involved with if you want to see a cultural change. And so that's what I'm going to challenge you with. That's what I'll leave you with. If this stuff is of interest to you, I would send you books that we have on the table back there. There's one called The American Story. There's another called The Founder's Bible. There's a lot of the stuff that you can learn from history here. God bless you guys. Thanks for letting me share.